The winter of 1943 had settled heavily across northern France. Snow draped the countryside in a suffocating white blanket, and the chill wind carried whispers of war, fear, and desperation. Among the stark fences and watchtowers of Stalag FIGC, a German prisoner of war camp, the air was thick with tension. Captured soldiers, stripped from their units during the bloody battles on the Eastern Front, lived under the watchful eyes of Allied guards. The camp, like many others, was a place of discipline, deprivation, and quiet despair. Yet, it was all. Don't miss a single POW escape story. Subscribe now and uncover the secrets that history tried to hide. Also a crucible where courage and ingenuity could surface in the most unlikely forms. Among the prisoners was Lieutenant Karl Richter, a young German officer, whose reputation for cunning had preceded him even in captivity. Captured during a failed offensive in the Russian steppes, Karl had endured months of isolation, interrogation, and endless monotony within the camp. His fellow prisoners whispered about him, calling him the Shadow, for he moved quietly, observed meticulously, and spoke little. But when he did, his words carried a weight that drew attention. The camp itself was nothing short of a fortress. High barbed wire fences encircled the grounds, punctuated by tall watchtowers with armed guards who scanned the perimeter tirelessly. Beneath the fences ran shallow ditches filled with ice-cold water, a silent warning to those foolish enough to attempt an escape. Inside the camp, life was regimented. Roll calls at dawn, labor details in the bitter cold, meals of thin broth and stale bread, and the constant psychological strain of captivity. Yet for Karl, the camp was less a prison and more a chessboard. He observed the guards' routines, studied their patterns, and imagined the possibilities that lay just beyond the fences. It was during one bitterly cold evening that the idea first took root in Karl's mind. As he huddled in the barracks, listening to the distant groans of men and the occasional bark of a guard, he began to draft in his mind what would later become the most audacious escape the Allies had ever encountered. The plan was simple in concept but perilous in execution. A small group of prisoners would tunnel under the fences, using crude tools fashioned from scraps, and disappear into the forest that lay just beyond the camp's boundary. The first step was recruitment. Karl was careful, knowing that a single misstep could lead to failure or death. He sought men who were not only skilled, but who also possessed unwavering resolve. Among them were Hauptmann Dieter Vogel, a stoic veteran with a background in engineering, and Gefreiter Hans Bauer, a weary young man, known for his agility and quick thinking. Together, they formed a silent council, meeting under the cover of night in the shadowed corners of the barracks, whispering plans and marking the hours until opportunities would strike. The digging began with nothing more than spoons, tin cups, and bare hands. Each night, the men would work in shifts, moving soil into hidden compartments beneath the floorboards of their barracks. The work was grueling. Their fingers were raw. Their muscles screamed in protest, and each scrape of metal against stone seemed to echo through the camp like an alarm bell. Yet, despite the physical strain, a shared sense of purpose sustained them. Every handful of dirt removed, every inch of tunnel completed, was a step closer to freedom. Meanwhile, Karl used every moment of daylight to reinforce their cover. He staged small arguments with guards, created distractions, and even faked illness to test the responsiveness of the camp's medical officers. His attention to detail was meticulous. He knew that even the smallest inconsistency could unravel months of planning. The men learned to communicate in subtle signals, a tap on the wall, a flick of a sleeve, so that their activities remained invisible to the untrained eye. As weeks turned into months, the tunnel grew longer and more elaborate. It twisted and turned beneath the frozen ground, reinforced with wooden planks scavenged from the barracks. They installed rudimentary ventilation shafts, ensuring that the air remained breathable during the long hours underground. They stored rations, a compass, and maps crafted from smuggled scraps of paper. Every element was accounted for, every risk calculated, Yet the most remarkable aspect of this escape was not the physical labor, but the psychological endurance. The men had to live with the constant fear of discovery, the claustrophobia of being buried beneath the earth, and the gnawing hunger that never seemed to relent. It was here that Carl's leadership shone. He offered quiet encouragement, reminded them of the stakes, and cultivated a shared vision of freedom. Under his guidance, the men moved with purpose, synchronizing their shifts, monitoring the guards' patrols, and refining their escape route with surgical precision. The night finally arrived when the tunnel was complete. A new moon hung low in the sky, shrouding the camp in darkness. The guards were fewer than usual, many distracted by distant explosions from the front lines. One by one, Karl, Dicketer, Hans, and a small cadre of trusted men descended into the tunnel. Their hearts pounded in unison with every cautious step, their breaths forming clouds in the icy air. Hours stretched like days as they crawled beneath the camp, the soil closing in around them with every movement. Emerging into the forest beyond, the men were immediately confronted by the harsh reality of their endeavor. Snow crunched beneath their boots, and the bitter wind bit through their thin uniforms. They were free from the camp, but the journey ahead was fraught with danger. Allied patrols, hostile villages, and treacherous terrain awaited them. Yet, for the first time in months, the taste of possibility filled their lungs, a taste they would never forget. Karl knew the importance of moving silently, avoiding roads, and finding shelter before dawn. They navigated by the stars and the compass, hidden within their packs, following a route carefully plotted over weeks of clandestine observation. Every rustle in the forest could be an enemy patrol, every distant shout a signal of imminent capture. They pressed on, driven by a mixture of fear, hope, and sheer determination. By the third day, they had covered miles through snow-laden forests, surviving on scavenged rations, and the occasional hidden stream for water. Exhaustion was a constant companion, but their spirits remained unbroken. They were no longer prisoners of a camp. They were fugitives in a war-torn land, and each step a rebellion against the confines of captivity and the brutality of war. It was during this journey that the full impact of Karl's planning became evident. They encountered natural obstacles, harsh weather, and the omnipresent threat of Allied forces. Yet the foresight of every preparation, the hidden rations, the maps, the knowledge of patrol patterns, allowed them to overcome each challenge. The escape was no longer a simple act of physical tunneling. It was a demonstration of human ingenuity, resilience, and the unyielding will to survive. As the men pressed onward, word of the escape began to reach the Allied authorities, though the details remained murky. The audacity of the operation, an organized, coordinated breakout from one of the most secure POW camps, shocked commanders and forced them to rethink security measures. Reports circulated of a ghost unit of German soldiers slipping through the snowy forests. The sigh. Chopper, leaving no trace except the disturbed snow and the silence of the camp that had once held them captive. By the end of Part 1, Karl and his small team had vanished into history, leaving behind only whispers of their courage, meticulous planning, and the indomitable spirit that had carried them from the depths of captivity into the uncertain freedom of the world beyond. The camp fences, their story untold for decades, serves as a testament to the human desire for liberty and the extraordinary lengths men will go to reclaim it. The forest stretched endlessly before Karl Richter and his small band of escapees. Snow blanketed the ground, hiding roots, rocks, and the uneven terrain that threatened to betray their every step. The bitter wind cut through their thin uniforms, and their lungs burned with every breath. Yet the taste of freedom, exhilarating and terrifying, propelled them forward. Despite the months of meticulous planning within the POW camp, the reality outside was far harsher. The camp was a controlled environment. The forest, a sprawling labyrinth of uncertainty. Every snap of a twig, every distant howl of a wolf, became a potential threat. And above all, there were the Allied patrols. Soldiers trained to detect the faintest sign of movement, searching tirelessly for prisoners like them. Carl led the group silently, moving under the cover of darkness, guided by the compass he had smuggled from the camp. His mind worked constantly, calculating distance, estimating patrol routes, and anticipating dangers. Hans Bauer, agile and keen-eyed, scouted ahead, crouching low and disappearing into the shadows to check for obstacles or soldiers. Dieter Vogel, burdened with carrying their makeshift maps and rations, brought a steady calm to the group, reminding them that patience and strategy would be their allies in this treacherous journey. The first night was the most harrowing. Visibility was 0, and the forest seemed alive with hidden threats. Snow muffled their steps, yet the constant crunch beneath their boots felt deafening. They huddled in a hollow between 2 massive pines, shivering and whispering, rationing the tiny scraps of bread and frozen water they had brought from the tunnel. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs, fatigue clawed at their limbs, and yet the thought of recapture was far worse. Captured again, they would likely face harsh punishment, possibly even execution. Freedom, fragile and uncertain, was the only thing keeping their resolve intact. By the second day, the forest had revealed both its danger and its mercy. A hidden stream provided fresh water, while dense undergrowth offered concealment from patrolling soldiers. Carl instructed the men to remain low, to move in short bursts, and to keep constant watch. Each step was calculated, each decision a matter of life and death. Their survival depended on trust, coordination, and an unwavering commitment to their plan. On the third day, the group encountered their first human obstacle, a small Allied outpost patrolling the outskirts of a village. Carl had foreseen this possibility and had prepared an alternate route through a nearby ravine. The ravine, steep and icy, required every ounce of balance and strength to navigate. The men inched along the edge, hands clawing at frozen rocks, their boots slipping in the ice. One misstep could send them tumbling into the snow-covered abyss, but Carl's calm instructions guided them safely. They emerged hours later, bruised, exhausted, but alive. A small victory that strengthened their resolve. Food remained their greatest challenge. They had carried only a few days' rations from the camp, and scavenging in the forest or villages was risky. Carl taught them to forage discreetly. Nuts, frozen berries, and occasionally a rabbit caught in a snare they fashioned from twine. Each meal was meager, yet it sustained them, and more importantly, it reinforced their belief that they could survive outside the confines of the camp. By the 5th night, the psychological strain began to show. Sleep was nearly impossible. Every rustle of leaves or distant shout triggered panic. The men were haunted not only by the immediate threat of capture, but also by memories of those left behind in the camp. Their families, their comrades, and even the prisoners who had trusted them now remained trapped, their fates uncertain. Carl knew he had to maintain morale. He reminded the men of their purpose, to reclaim their lives, to return home, and to defy the odds. Stories from the camp, secret letters, whispered dreams of freedom, became both comfort and motivation during these long, sleepless nights. On the 6th day, disaster nearly struck. While crossing a partially frozen river, Hans slipped, plunging into the icy water. His screams pierced the silent forest, drawing the attention of nearby patrols. Carl acted immediately, plunging into the frigid water to pull his friend to safety. Shivering and numb, Hans clung to Carl, and together they struggled to the riverbank. The close call reminded them that freedom came at a price, and that every misstep could be fatal. Yet it also reinforced their unity. Their survival depended on each other, as much as on the careful planning Carl had initiated months before. As they pressed further, the escapees faced not only physical dangers, but the challenge of navigating unfamiliar terrain. Carl had studied maps and memorized landmarks from the camp, but the forest was vast, and the snow had obscured many of his reference points. Each day was a careful balance of moving forward, avoiding roads, and finding shelter before nightfall. The nights were brutally cold. They huddled in makeshift shelters of branches and snow, fighting frostbite and exhaustion. Their conversations when they occurred were whispers, plans for the next day, memories of home, and occasional reassurances that they were still alive. By the 10th day, their efforts began to bear fruit. Carl led them to a series of abandoned farmhouses, remnants of villages evacuated or destroyed by the war. These structures offered brief refuge, and occasionally they found food hidden by locals or scavenged from the ruins. It was here that the psychological dimension of their escape became evident. The men were no longer prisoners. They were human beings reclaiming agency, making choices, and asserting their will against the relentless tide of war. Yet, danger remained constant. Allied patrols intensified as reports of the escape reached local authorities. Carl's small band had become a ghost story among soldiers, a group of German POWs, moving silently through the snow, leaving only faint footprints and rumors behind. One evening, a patrol stumbled almost directly upon their shelter. Carl's calm assessment and quick thinking averted disaster. They hid beneath debris, held their breath, and waited while the soldiers passed mere yards away. The tension was suffocating, but their discipline and trust in each other ensured survival. By the end of the second week, Carl, Dieter, Hans, and the remaining escapees had traveled dozens of miles, navigating forests, rivers, and hills with precision and stealth. Exhaustion, hunger, and the cold had taken a toll, yet they pressed onward. Their ultimate goal was the neutral border, a distance of hundreds of miles, where they might finally be safe from Allied capture. Every day they relied on Carl's leadership, Dieter's engineering skills, and Hans's agility. Every decision, when to rest or to forage, which paths to avoid, was critical. As the sun set on the 14th day of their flight, Carl paused to survey the horizon. The forest stretched endlessly, a mixture of shadows and snow, beauty and menace intertwined. The men around him were weary, faces streaked with grime and frostbite, yet their eyes held a determination that refused to waver. They were fugitives in a war-torn land, yet they embodied hope, the indomitable will of men refusing to be broken by captivity. The story of this escape would later shock the Allies, not only because of its audacity but also because of the meticulous planning, courage, and resilience displayed by the men. It was a testament to human ingenuity and the relentless pursuit of freedom. The names of Karl Richter, Dieter Vogel, and Hans Bauer would become legend among POWs and soldiers alike, whispered in barracks and documented in secret reports that chronicled one of the most daring escapes of the Second World War. And yet the journey was far from over. Part 2 of their story captures not only the perilous journey through enemy territory, but also the moments of ingenuity, bravery, and near disaster that defined the escape. Their survival depended on courage, camaraderie, and the unwavering belief that freedom was worth every risk. The bitter chill of late winter had given way to the tentative warmth of early spring, but the landscape remained unforgiving. Snow had melted into mud, streams ran high, and the once familiar forests had transformed into a maze of shadows and treacherous terrain. Karl Richter and his band of escapees, Dieter Vogel, Hans Bauer, and 2 others, continued their perilous journey, each day a struggle against hunger, fatigue, and the ever-present threat of Allied patrols. By now the men were exhausted. Their muscles ached, their hands were raw, and sleep was a rare luxury snatched in brief intervals beneath the gnarled roots of ancient trees or within abandoned huts. Yet freedom was tangible, almost within reach, and that hope sustained them. Every mile they traveled, every forest they crossed, brought them closer to the neutral border that promised sanctuary. Karl's mind, sharp and relentless, remained focused. He studied maps he had painstakingly recreated from memory, marking villages to avoid, rivers to ford, and roads that must never be crossed. Each decision carried enormous weight. One wrong turn could lead them straight into a patrol, or worse, an armed checkpoint. He had learned early that caution was their lifeline. patience their ally. The forest seemed alive with both opportunity and menace. Birds once caged in the camp now soared above, signaling the approach of day. Wolves howled in the distance, reminding the men that nature itself was a force to be respected. Yet the forest also provided cover. Dense underbrush, fallen trees, and overgrown ravines became shields against the watchful eyes of soldiers scouring the land. Every step was calculated, every movement measured to avoid detection. Food remained their constant struggle. Foraging yielded meager results: wild roots, frozen berries, the occasional rabbit trapped by Hans's nimble hands. Each meal was a lifeline, but it was never enough to fully replenish their energy. Hunger gnawed at their resolve. Yet Carl reminded them that endurance was as much a weapon as any rifle or map. Their survival depended on their wits, their discipline, and each other. The first major obstacle of their journey came in the form of a small Allied checkpoint, along a narrow road near a village. Carl had anticipated this, but the patrol was larger and better equipped than expected. The men crouched in the shadows, barely breathing as soldiers moved past mere meters away. The tension was unbearable. A single misstep, a snapped twig, a cough, a faint exhale, could mean capture. Time seemed suspended as the patrol lingered, inspecting crates and wagons, before finally moving on. Only when the sounds of boots faded into the distance did Carl allow the group to exhale. Their relief mingled with renewed vigilance. By the seventh day, the escapees had reached a series of rolling hills that marked the outskirts of Allied-controlled territory. The terrain was less treacherous than the forest, but the danger was heightened by exposure. They were now visible from afar. Any observer could spot them against the pale landscape. Carl ordered them to move at night. To rest during the day in concealed hollows, or behind haystacks in abandoned farms. Each night brought both terror and hope. The terror of being discovered, the hope of another step closer to freedom. One night, while hiding in a crumbling barn, the men overheard distant voices. Local farmers, unaware of the fugitives, spoke in hushed tones about soldiers sighted in the area. Carl quickly deduced that the news of their escape had spread farther than anticipated. Their movements had to become even more cautious. Every step, every breath, every sound became part of a delicate dance with fate. As they neared him. As they neared a narrow river crossing, the escapees faced another challenge. The river, swollen by melting snow, presented a formidable barrier. Its currents were swift, its banks steep and slippery. Crossing it would be dangerous, but waiting was not an option. Carl instructed the men to tie ropes from scavenged materials, to support each other, and to move in synchronized shifts. Hours of careful maneuvering allowed them to cross without incident, each man soaked, shivering, but alive. The crossing was a testament to their ingenuity and teamwork, qualities that had been honed over weeks of perilous planning and relentless practice. By the 10th night, they reached a series of small villages along the border. The towns were eerily quiet. War had emptied many of them, leaving only the skeletal remains of homes and the occasional wary villager. Carl used these shadows of civilization to their advantage. They stole brief warmth by hiding in attics, scavenged food from abandoned pantries, and avoided roads patrolled by Allied soldiers. Each action was measured, precise, and fraught with the tension of imminent danger. Finally, after nearly 3 weeks of relentless travel, the men approached the border. Neutral territory lay ahead, a place where Allied soldiers would not pursue them, and where safety, however relative, awaited. The forest gave way to rolling fields, the snow thinned, and the air carried a sense of possibility. Carl signaled the group to halt, scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. All seemed quiet. Their hearts raced, not from fear but from the anticipation of victory. In the early hours of the morning, under the cover of darkness, Carl led his group across the border. Relief, disbelief, and triumph surged through them in equal measure. They had done it. Against incredible odds, they had escaped captivity, evaded patrols, and traversed hostile territory. Their freedom was hard-won, a testament to human courage, intelligence, and resilience. You know, the news of their escape sent shockwaves through the Allied command. How could a small group of prisoners, meticulously planning under constant surveillance, vanish without a trace? Reports circulated, patrols were intensified, and yet the escapees remained ghosts, unseen, unheard, yet very real. Their story, when eventually documented, became one of the most remarkable POW escapes of the Second World War, inspiring future generations and leaving historians in awe. Karl, Dieter, Hans, and their companions had not only survived, they had triumphed. They had defied captivity, navigated perilous terrain, and outwitted the forces that sought to contain them. Their journey would forever be remembered as a symbol of resilience, ingenuity, and the indomitable human spirit. And while this marked the end of their immediate journey to freedom, the story of Karl Richter and his band of escapees would continue to echo through history, whispered in barracks, recorded in secret diaries, and celebrated in accounts of courage and survival. The escape that had shocked the Allies was now etched into the annals of war, a tale of daring, determination, and hope that no obstacle, no matter how formidable, could extinguish.